There's a photograph that hangs in the Haversham estate archives. It was taken in the spring of 1931 on the front steps of a mansion in rural Virginia. In it, 7 children stand in descending height order, their eyes fixed on something just beyond the camera's frame. Their mouths are closed, their expressions are identical, not quite smiling, not quite afraid, just blank, waiting. What the photograph doesn't tell you is that none of those children had ever spoken a single word. Not because they couldn't hear, not because they lacked the physical ability, but because 10 generations of calculated, deliberate inbreeding had twisted something deep in their genetic code, something that controlled the very capacity for human speech. The Haversham children were born silent, and their silence, as you'll soon understand, was the least disturbing thing about them. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. This is a story that was buried for nearly a century. It involves one of America's oldest families, a fortune built on tobacco and land, and a breeding program so meticulous, so coldly executed, that by the time it ended, the Haversham bloodline had become something unrecognizable. The medical records were sealed, the estate was abandoned, and the last surviving member of the family died in 1994 without ever giving an interview, but the records exist, hospital logs, census data, handwritten journals kept by the family physician, a man named Dr. Emery Thorne, who documented every birth, every deformity, every strange anomaly that emerged as the Haversham family folded in on itself, generation after generation. What he wrote in those journals would make your blood run cold, because this isn't just a story about genetics gone wrong. It's about what happens when wealth, power, and obsession are allowed to operate in total secrecy. It's about a family that believed they were preserving something sacred, and instead created something monstrous. And it's about 7 children who lived their entire lives in silence, unable to scream, unable to cry out, even when they desperately wanted to. So let's go back to 1763, back to the very beginning of the Haversham line, back to when the first seeds of this nightmare were planted. The Haversham family arrived in Virginia in 1763, during the final years of colonial rule. They came from Cornwall, England, a rugged, isolated region known for its tin mines and its people's stubborn refusal to mix with outsiders. The family patriarch, Nathaniel Haversham, brought with him 3 things: a land grant from the British Crown, a fortune made in maritime trade, and a belief system that would shape his descendants for the next 2.5 centuries. Nathaniel believed in purity, not just racial purity, though that was certainly part of it. He believed in what he called the preservation of essence, the idea that a family's strength, intelligence, and divine favor could only be maintained through careful, controlled breeding. He had seen too many great families in England diluted by marriage to merchants' daughters, to foreign nobles, to anyone outside their carefully guarded circles. He swore that his line would never suffer that fate. So when Nathaniel's son, Thomas, came of age in 1789, he was not permitted to court girls from neighboring plantations. He was not allowed to attend social gatherings where he might meet someone unsuitable. Instead, Thomas married his own first cousin, Elizabeth Haversham, a pale, quiet girl who had been raised in the same household. The family celebrated the union as a triumph of bloodline preservation. The local church, dependent on Haversham donations, performed the ceremony without question. Their children were healthy, 6 in total, 4 boys and 2 girls. By all accounts, they were intelligent, well-formed, and showed no obvious signs of defect. This only reinforced Nathaniel's belief that he had been right all along. Purity worked, isolation worked, and so the pattern was set. By the 1830s, the Haversham estate had grown to over 3,000 acres. They owned 200 enslaved people who worked the tobacco fields and maintained the sprawling manor house. But despite their wealth and influence, the Haversham family had become increasingly insular. They stopped attending county gatherings. They declined invitations to balls and assemblies. They built walls, literal stone walls, round their property, marking the boundary between their world and everyone else's. And within those walls, cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. In one particularly disturbing case documented in the family Bible, a widowed father married his own daughter after his wife's death in 1847, justifying it as a way to keep the estate unified under one bloodline. The local authorities, either bribed or simply unwilling to confront one of the region's wealthiest families, turned a blind eye. For 3 generations, the consequences were minimal. A child born with a clubfoot here, a daughter with unusually pale skin and sensitivity to sunlight there. Nothing that couldn't be hidden, managed, or explained away as individual misfortune, rather than the inevitable result of a genetic pool that was rapidly shrinking. But by the late 1800s, something had begun to change. Dr. Emery Thorne, the family physician who had served the Haversham household since 1876, started noticing patterns. Children who took longer to walk, siblings who shared identical, unusual facial structures, a pair of twins born in 1893 who both had extra vertebrae in their spines, an anomaly so rare that seeing it in both children was statistically impossible unless the parents were closely related. Thorne kept meticulous notes, and what he documented in the final decades of the 19th century would serve as a warning that the Haversham family chose to completely ignore. The first silent child was born in 1902. His name was William Haversham V, and when he emerged into the world on a freezing January morning, he did not cry. The midwife waited. Dr. Thorne waited. The mother, a frail woman named Margaret, who had married her second cousin, waited with increasing panic. But no sound came. At first, they thought the infant was simply calm. Some babies don't cry immediately, but as the hours passed, then days, then weeks, it became clear that something was profoundly wrong. William would open his mouth when hungry, he would gasp when startled, but no vocalization emerged, not a whimper, not a coo, nothing. Dr. Thorne examined the child extensively. The larynx appeared normal. The vocal cords were present and seemed properly formed. There was no physical obstruction, no cleft palate, no obvious deformity that would explain the silence. The child could hear perfectly. He would turn his head toward sounds, startle at loud noises. His cognitive development seemed normal in every other regard. He simply could not or would not produce sound. Thorne wrote in his journal that evening, "I have delivered over 400 children in my career. I have never seen anything like this. The child is not mute in the traditional sense. It is as though the neurological connection between intention and vocalization has been severed. He opens his mouth to cry, but his body does not know how." The family was disturbed but not panicked. Wealthy families had dealt with disabled children before. William was kept in the house, away from public view. They hired specialized tutors. They tried every experimental treatment available at the time: electrical stimulation, hypnosis, herbal remedies imported from Europe. Nothing worked. William Haversham V grew into a silent, watchful child who communicated through gestures and eventually through writing. But he was not the last. In 1906, Margaret gave birth to twins. Both were silent. In 1910, William's sister Elena married their mutual cousin, and her first child was also born without a voice. By 1915, Dr. Thorne had documented 8 silent children across 3 branches of the Haversham family. The pattern was undeniable. This was not random misfortune. This was genetic. Thorne confronted the family patriarch, Edmund Haversham, in the winter of 1916. He brought his medical journals. He brought charts showing the family tree and the increasing frequency of the condition. He begged Edmund to understand that continued intermarriage was creating these children, that the bloodline had become so concentrated that recessive genetic mutations were now expressing themselves with terrifying regularity. Edmund's response was chilling. According to Thorne's notes, the old man looked at the evidence, closed the journal, and said simply, "Better silent than diluted. At least they are still ours." The doctor tried to reason with him. He explained that the condition would likely worsen, that other deformities might follow, that the family was walking toward a genetic catastrophe. But Edmund was unmoved. The Haversham family had maintained their purity for over 150 years. They had resisted the temptation to marry into lesser families, to contaminate their line with outside blood, and they would not stop now. Thorne considered reporting the family to state authorities. But what would he report them for? Marrying cousins was legal in Virginia. The children, though voiceless, were otherwise cared for. There was no law against what the Haversham family was doing to itself. And Thorne, despite his horror, remained on the family payroll. He had a wife and 3 children of his own to support, so he stayed, and he watched, and he documented everything. By 1925, there were 14 silent children living on the Haversham estate. They ranged in age from infancy to 23 years old. They had learned to communicate with each other through an elaborate system of hand signals and written notes. They moved through the mansion like ghosts, their footsteps the only sound they ever made. And the family kept breeding. By 1928, the Haversham family had reached what Dr. Thorne grimly referred to in his journals as the point of no return. The 10th generation was coming of age, and with them came afflictions that went far beyond silence. There was Charlotte, born in 1926, who not only lacked speech, but also appeared to have no response to pain. Her mother discovered this when Charlotte was 2 years old and placed her hand directly on a hot stove. The child didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Her flesh sizzled and burned while she stared at it with detached curiosity. The only reason her mother noticed was the smell. There was James, born in 1927, whose eyes didn't track movement properly. He could see, but his gaze would drift independently, as though each eye was searching for something different. He walked into walls. He couldn't judge distances, and like all the others, he made no sound, even when he fell and bloodied his nose on the marble floors. There were the twins, Richard and Raymond, born in 1929, who seemed neurologically linked in ways that defied medical explanation. When one felt pain, the other would react. When one became agitated, the other would mirror the behavior exactly, even if they were in separate rooms. Thorne tested this repeatedly and could find no rational explanation. It was as though their nervous systems had somehow cross-wired in the womb, but the most disturbing case was a girl named Abigail, born in January of 1930. Abigail was the daughter of 2 parents who were themselves the product of uncle-niece marriages going back 3 generations. Her family tree didn't branch, it was nearly a straight line. Abigail was born silent, like the others. But she also had what Thorne described as an absence of normal human affect. She didn't smile, she didn't cry. She showed no fear, no joy, no curiosity. She would sit for hours staring at nothing, her hands folded in her lap, barely blinking. When her mother tried to hold her, Abigail's body would go rigid, not in distress, but in what appeared to be complete indifference. Thorne wrote, "I do not believe this child experiences emotion as we understand it. She eats when food is placed before her. She sleeps when darkness comes, but there is no spark of personhood behind her eyes. It is as though the family has bred the humanity out of itself. The estate had become a nightmare. 23 silent children now lived within its walls, ranging from infants to adults in their late 20s. The older ones had learned to function, to perform basic tasks, to communicate through gestures. But the younger ones, those born after 1925, were increasingly impaired. Some couldn't walk properly, others had seizures. One child, a boy named Thomas, was born with his internal organs partially reversed, a condition called situs inversus that occurs in only 1 in 10,000 births, but had now appeared twice in the Haversham line in 5 years. The adult family members, the ones who still possessed speech, who had been born before the genetic collapse accelerated, began to fracture psychologically under the weight of what they'd created. Thorne documented instances of severe depression, paranoia, and at least 2 suicide attempts among the speaking generation. They couldn't leave because leaving would mean abandoning the children and admitting to the outside world what had happened. But staying meant living in a house full of silent, damaged offspring who served as constant reminders of their family's hubris. In 1930, the family made a collective decision. They would have one final generation. 7 couples, all closely related, all committed to the Haversham legacy, would each produce 1 child. These 7 children would be raised together, educated together, and eventually paired off to continue the line. It would be a controlled experiment in genetic preservation, they told themselves, a way to stabilize what had gone wrong. Dr. Thorne begged them not to. He showed them photographs of the existing children. He read aloud from his medical journals, describing the progressive deterioration he'd witnessed over 30 years. He told them, in the plainest language possible, that they were creating suffering for no purpose other than pride. But the decision had been made. Between 1931 and 1933, 7 children were born. They were photographed on the mansion steps in the spring of 1931, the photograph I mentioned at the beginning of this story. 7 children, descending in height, all staring at something beyond the camera. All 7 were born without voices, and by the time they reached adolescence, it would become clear that silence was the least of their problems. The 7 children of the final generation were named in order of birth: Nathaniel, Eleanor, Thomas, Margaret, William, Charlotte, and Catherine. They were born between March of 1931 and November of 1933, and from the moment of their births, Dr. Thorne knew they were different even from the previous silent children. These 7 didn't just lack voices, they seemed to lack something more fundamental. Nathaniel, the eldest, didn't make eye contact until he was 4 years old. Eleanor developed a repetitive behavior where she would touch every doorframe 3 times before passing through it. If interrupted, she would become violent, clawing at her own arms until they bled. Thomas appeared cognitively normal until age 6, when he suddenly stopped responding to his own name, stopped acknowledging the presence of others, and would only eat food if it was arranged in specific geometric patterns on his plate. Margaret, born in January of 1932, had what we would now recognize as severe autism, though that diagnosis didn't exist in any meaningful way at the time. She couldn't bear to be touched. She would rock back and forth for hours, her silent mouth forming shapes that might have been words if she could produce sound. When frustrated, she would bang her head against walls with such force that the family had to pad the corners of every room she occupied. William, the 5th child, seemed almost normal by comparison. He was silent, yes, but he could read by age 4, could write in elegant script by age 7, and showed genuine affection toward his siblings. But he also had seizures, violent, unpredictable episodes where his body would convulse and his eyes would roll back. Thorne counted 40, 3 seizures in William's first 10 years of life. Each one left the boy weaker, more distant, more trapped inside a body that was slowly failing him. Charlotte and Catherine, the youngest, were born 11 months apart. They were both small, fragile, with translucent skin that showed the blue veins beneath. They moved in perfect synchronization, like the twins Richard and Raymond before them, but even more pronounced. They held hands constantly. They slept in the same bed. If separated, both would enter states of extreme distress, Charlotte pulling out her hair in clumps, while Catherine scratched at the door until her fingernails bled. The family tried to maintain normalcy. They hired private tutors who taught the children through written lessons. They maintained the estate, kept the grounds immaculate, continued to present themselves to the rare outside visitor as a respectable, if eccentric, old Virginia family. But inside the mansion, something closer to a prison had emerged. The children couldn't leave the property. The family feared what would happen if the outside world saw them, if questions were asked, if authorities became involved. So the 7 grew up behind those stone walls, knowing nothing of the world beyond. They had each other. They had their silent communication, a complex system of gestures, facial expressions, and written notes that allowed them to convey basic needs and simple thoughts. But they had no friends, no exposure to other children, no understanding that their existence was not normal. Dr. Thorne continued his documentation, but his tone had changed. Where once his journal entries had been clinical and detached, by the mid-1930s they had become almost confessional. He wrote about his own complicity, his own cowardice, the fact that he had taken Haversham money for decades while watching them destroy themselves. In March of 1939, he wrote, "I delivered Nathaniel 8 years ago. Today I watched him try to tell his mother something. He opened his mouth, his face contorted with effort, and nothing came out. The frustration in his eyes was unbearable. He wanted to scream, every part of him wanted to scream, but the scream doesn't exist inside him. It was bred out 10 generations ago, and now he suffers for the arrogance of people who died before he was born. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline?" By 1940, the adult members of the family had begun dying off, some from natural causes, others from what Thorne delicately described as self-inflicted departures. The estate staff dwindled. The fortune, which had seemed infinite, was being depleted by medical expenses and the cost of maintaining total secrecy. And the 7 children, now ranging in age from 7 to 9 years old, were left increasingly in each other's care. They created their own world, a world of silence and gesture, of ritual and routine. They would gather each evening in the library and arrange themselves in order of height, just like in that photograph. They would sit there for hours, not reading, not playing, just existing in each other's presence. The only family they had ever known. The only voices they would never hear. The beginning of the end came in 1946, when Dr. Emery Thorne suffered a stroke and died at the age of 74. His passing left the Haversham family without medical supervision for the first time in 7 decades. His son briefly considered taking over the practice, but after reading his father's journals, all 32 volumes of them, he refused to set foot on the estate. He later told a colleague that what his father had documented was an abomination that should have been stopped generations ago. Without Thorne, the family had no buffer between themselves and the outside world, and the outside world was changing. The Second World War had ended. Virginia was modernizing. Social services were expanding. Questions were being asked about families like the Havershams who had operated in complete isolation for so long. In 1948, a county health inspector arrived unannounced at the estate. He had been tasked with conducting a routine census update, nothing more. But what he found disturbed him enough that he filed a report with the state. He described seeing multiple children and young adults who appeared to be profoundly disabled, living in conditions of benign neglect. He noted that none of them spoke, that they moved through the house like ghosts, that the few remaining adult family members seemed overwhelmed and possibly mentally unstable themselves. The report triggered an investigation. In June of 1949, a team of state social workers and a physician arrived at the estate with a court order. What they discovered was documented in a 53-page report that was immediately sealed and would remain classified for the next 45 years. The 7 children of the final generation, now aged 16 to 18, were living in what the report described as a state of profound isolation and developmental deprivation. They were physically healthy, relatively speaking, but psychologically they had been shaped by a lifetime of silence and confinement. They had no concept of the outside world. They had never left the estate grounds. They had never interacted with anyone outside their immediate family. The report documented their unusual behaviors in clinical detail. How Nathaniel would spend hours arranging and rearranging objects by size and color. How Eleanor still touched every doorframe 3 times and would become violent if prevented. How Thomas had stopped acknowledging human presence entirely and would only interact with the family's cats, which he treated with surprising gentleness. How Margaret still rocked and banged her head, her forehead permanently scarred from years of self-injury. But the most disturbing finding was about William, Charlotte, and Catherine. William's seizures had worsened dramatically. He was having multiple episodes per day, and each one left him weaker. Charlotte and Catherine, now 15 and 14, had developed what the examining physician called a pathological codependence. They could not be separated even for medical examination. When staff tried to take them to different rooms, both began having what appeared to be simultaneous panic attacks, their silent mouths open in soundless screams, their bodies convulsing identically. The state wanted to remove the children, to place them in institutions where they could receive proper care, where they might learn to function in some capacity in the modern world. But the remaining Haversham adults fought back with lawyers and money. They argued that the children would die if removed from the only environment they'd ever known, that their conditions were genetic, not the result of neglect, and that no institution could provide better care than the family estate. The legal battle dragged on for 3 years. During that time, the children remained at the estate, but now under state supervision. Social workers visited monthly. Medical professionals came and went. And for the first time in their lives, the 7 silent children were exposed to outsiders who looked at them with pity rather than acceptance. In 1951, William died. He was 19 years old. The official cause of death was listed as seizure-related cardiac arrest. But Thorne's successor noted in a private memo that the young man had also shown signs of severe malnutrition and possible self-neglect. It appeared he had simply stopped eating in the weeks before his death. Whether this was due to his deteriorating condition or a conscious choice, no one could say. He had no voice to tell them. William's death broke something in the other 6. According to staff reports, they stopped engaging in their usual routines. They stopped arranging themselves by height in the library. Eleanor stopped touching doorframes. Thomas stopped caring for the cats. They simply withdrew, each into their own silent world, barely acknowledging even each other. In 1952, the court finally ruled the remaining 6 children would stay at the estate, but under permanent state guardianship. The Haversham family would retain ownership of the property, but all decisions regarding the children's care would be made by appointed medical professionals. It was, in essence, the end of the Haversham family as an autonomous unit. The adults who remained, A handful of aging cousins and second cousins gradually died off through the 1950s and 60s. By 1970, there were no speaking Havershams left. Only the 6 silent survivors of the final generation, now in their late 30s and early 40s, living in an increasingly decaying mansion with rotating staff who viewed their assignment as a punishment. The final chapter of the Haversham family unfolded slowly, quietly, in a way that seemed almost merciful compared to everything that had come before. But mercy is not the right word for what happened to those last 6 children. What they experienced was simply the long, inevitable unwinding of a genetic catastrophe that had been set in motion over 200 years earlier. By 1975, Nathaniel, Eleanor, Thomas, Margaret, Charlotte, and Catherine were in their mid-40s. They had outlived every speaking member of their family. The estate had fallen into disrepair. The roof leaked, the gardens had gone wild, and whole wings of the mansion had been closed off due to structural damage. The state continued to provide minimal funding for their care, but the staff turnover was constant. Few people wanted to work in a crumbling house with 6 middle-aged, profoundly disabled adults who could not speak, who barely seemed to register the passage of time. Thomas died in 1978. He was found in the garden one morning, lying peacefully beneath an oak tree, surrounded by the cats he had cared for his entire life. The autopsy revealed advanced heart disease, likely congenital. He was 47 years old. The remaining 5 attended his burial in the family cemetery behind the estate. They stood in a line in order of height, just as they had in that photograph from 1931. And they were silent. Eleanor died in 1981. The official cause was pneumonia, but the staff noted she had stopped eating weeks before. She would sit at the table during meals, her hands folded, staring at the doorframe she had touched compulsively for over 50 years. But she no longer reached out to touch it. It was as though some essential program in her mind had finally shut down. She was 50 years old. Margaret died in 1985 after a lifetime of self-injury finally took its toll. Her body, covered in scars from decades of head, banging and scratching, simply gave out. She had developed infections that wouldn't heal, wounds that wouldn't close. The staff did what they could, but Margaret had never learned to cooperate with medical treatment. She couldn't understand explanations, couldn't be reasoned with. She died in her sleep, her body finally at rest after a lifetime of unexplainable agitation. She was 53, that left only Nathaniel, Charlotte, and Catherine. The 3 of them moved through the decaying mansion like the last survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to routines that no longer had meaning. Nathaniel still arranged objects by size and color, though now he did it with whatever he could find. Sticks from the yard, buttons from old clothing, pieces of broken furniture. Charlotte and Catherine still held hands constantly, still slept in the same bed, still moved in that eerie synchronization they had shown since infancy. In 1990, the state finally made the decision to close the estate. The building was unsalvageable. The cost of maintaining 3 individuals in a mansion designed for dozens was indefensible. Nathaniel, Charlotte, and Catherine, now in their late 50s, were moved to a care facility in Richmond. It was the first time any of them had left the estate grounds in their entire lives. The transition was devastating. Nathaniel stopped arranging objects, he stopped eating, he stopped moving. Within 6 weeks of the move, he developed aspiration pneumonia and died. He was 59 years old. Staff reported that in his final days, he would stare out the window of his room toward the west, toward where the estate had been, his mouth open as if trying to call out to something he could no longer reach. Charlotte and Catherine lasted 3 more years. They adapted to the facility better than Nathaniel had, perhaps because they had each other. They would sit together in the common room, holding hands, watching the other residents with that same detached curiosity they'd shown their entire lives. The staff grew fond of them in a distant way. They were quiet. They caused no trouble. They were, in their own tragic way, easy to care for. But in February of 1994, Charlotte died suddenly of a brain aneurysm. She collapsed during breakfast, still holding Catherine's hand, and Catherine, who had never spent a single night apart from her sister in 62 years, simply shut down. She stopped eating, stopped drinking, stopped responding to any external stimuli. The doctors called it failure to thrive, but the staff who had known them understood it was something deeper. Catherine had lost the only person who had ever truly existed in her world. She died 9 days later. The official cause was dehydration and organ failure, but anyone who had seen her in those final days knew she had simply chosen to follow her sister. She was 61 years old. Catherine Haversham was buried in the family cemetery beside Charlotte, beside all her silent siblings, beside generations of Havershams who had built this night, one marriage, one birth, one silent child at a time. The estate was demolished in 1996. The land was sold to developers who built a subdivision of modest homes. The families who live there now have no idea what once stood on that ground. No idea about the children who lived and died behind those stone walls, unable to scream, unable to ask for help, unable to tell anyone what it felt like to be born into a family that valued purity over humanity. Dr. Emery Thorne's journals were unsealed in 2003. They're now housed in the Virginia Historical Society archives, available to researchers by appointment only. The photographs still exist, including that one from 1931, with 7 children standing on the steps, their mouths closed, their eyes staring at something just beyond the frame. When you look at that photograph now, knowing what you know, you can almost hear the silence. You can almost feel what those children felt, standing there in descending height order, trapped inside bodies that couldn't produce the most basic human sound, the sound of a voice, the sound of a cry, the sound of a scream that was bred out of them, generation by generation, until there was nothing left but silence. The Haversham line ended in 1994, not with a bang, not with a dramatic final chapter, but with a 61-year-old woman dying quietly in a care facility, her hand still reaching for her sister's, her mouth still open in a soundless goodbye that no one would ever hear. That's the story of the Haversham children. Born silent, dead silent, and forgotten by a world that never wanted to acknowledge what happens when pride, isolation, and obsession are allowed to masquerade as tradition for 10 generations. If this story disturbed you the way it disturbed me when I first discovered it in those archives, leave a comment below. Tell me what you think. Tell me if you've ever heard of other families like this, other bloodlines that destroyed themselves in the name of purity. And make sure you're subscribed, because stories like this, stories buried in history, waiting to be uncovered, are what this channel is all about. Thank you for watching, and remember, some silences are louder than screams.